Gentlemen, my reason for offering you this work is so logical. And after you have learned its plan, you will also, I am sure, have so logical a reason to take it under your protection that I believe nothing will recommend it to you more than a brief statement of what I herein propose to do. I have always thought that the two questions of God and of the soul were the principal questions among those that should be demonstrated by fractional philosophy rather than theology. For although it may suffice us faithful ones to believe by faith that there is a God and that the human soul does not perish with the body, certainly it does not seem possible ever to persuade those without faith to accept any religion, nor even perhaps any moral virtue, unless they can first be shown these two things by means of natural reason. And since in this life one frequently finds greater rewards offered for vice than for virtue, few persons would prefer the just to the useful if they were not restrained either by the fear of God or by the expectation of another life. It is absolutely true, both that we must believe that there is a God because it is so taught in the Holy Scriptures, and on the other hand, that we must believe the Holy Scriptures because they come from God. The reason for this is that faith is a gift of God, and the very God that gives us faith to believe other things can also give us faith to believe that He exists. Nevertheless, we could hardly offer this argument to those without faith, for they might suppose that we were committing the fallacy that logicians call circular reasoning. And truly, I have noticed that you, gentlemen, along with other theologians, assure us not only that the existence of God can be proved by natural reason, but also that we can infer from the Holy Scriptures that our knowledge of God is much clearer and easier than our knowledge of various created things. So clear, in fact, so absolutely easy to attain that those who do not possess it are blameworthy. This is evident in the words of the Book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 13, where it is said, "Howbeit they are not to be accused, for if their understanding was so great that they could discern the world and the creatures, why did they not rather find out the Lord thereof?" And in the epistle of the Romans, chapter 1, where it is said that they are without excuse. And again, in the same place, in these words, "That which may be known of God is manifest in them." It seems that we are being told that all that can be known of God can be demonstrated by reason, that we do not need to seek elsewhere than in ourselves, and that our minds alone are capable of furnishing us. That is why I have believed that it would not be appropriate if I showed here how that can be done, and by what means we can know God more easily and more certainly than we know the things of the world. And as for the soul, many have believed that it is not easy to understand its nature, and some have even dared to say that human reasoning would convince us that it perishes with the body, and that faith alone can teach us the contrary. Nevertheless, as the Lateran Council held under Leo X, Session 8 condemns these persons and expressly orders Christian philosophers to refute their arguments and to employ all their intellectual abilities to make the truth known. I have decided to make the attempt in this work. Moreover, the principle of reasoning, why many outside the church do not wish to believe that there is a God and that the human soul is distinct from the body, is that they claim that no one has so far been able to demonstrate these two things. I do not share their opinion. On the contrary, I hold that almost all of the arguments brought to bear on these two questions by so many illustrious men are valid demonstrations when they are properly understood, and that it is practically impossible to invent new ones. So I believe that there is nothing more useful to be done in philosophy than critically and carefully to seek out once and for all the best and most reliable of such arguments, and to give them so clear and exact a presentation that it would thenceforward be evident to everyone that they are valid demonstrations. And finally, several persons have urged me to do this, since they knew that I have been practicing a certain method of solving all sorts of difficulties in the sciences. A method which really is not new, for nothing is older than the truth, but which they knew I was using rather successfully in other matters. I have therefore considered it my duty to see what I could achieve in this field. I have put in this treatise everything that I was able to discover about this subject. That is not to say that I have collected here all the various arguments which might be adduced as proofs in our subject, for I have never thought that that would be necessary unless certain proof existed. I have only treated here of the most basic and principal ones in such a way that I can reasonably venture to maintain that they are very evident and very certain demonstrations. And I shall say further that they are such that I do not think there is any way in which the human mind can ever find better ones. For the importance of the subject and for the glory of God to which all this relates, constrain me to speak somewhat more freely of myself than I usually do. Nevertheless, whatever certainty and obviousness I find in my own arguments, I cannot convince myself that everyone will be able to understand them. There is a similar situation in geometry, where there are several proofs left to us by Archimedes, Apollonius, Pappus, and several others that are accepted by everyone as very certain and evident because they contain nothing but what, considered separately, is very easy to understand, and because there is no place where the consequences do not have an exact connection with the dependence upon their antecedents. Nevertheless, because these proofs are rather long and demand undivided attention, they are comprehended and understood by only a few persons. In the same way, although I consider that the arguments I use here equal or even surpass in certainty and obviousness the demonstrations of geometry, I nevertheless appreciate that they cannot be sufficiently well understood by many persons, partly because they also are somewhat lengthy and involved, but principally because they require a mind entirely free of all prejudice and one that could readily free itself from its attachment to the senses. And to tell the truth, there are not so many people in the world who are fitted for metaphysical speculations as there are those who are fitted for geometry. There is this further difference that in geometry, everyone is persuaded that nothing should be written for which there is no certain proof. Therefore, those who are not well versed in the field are much more apt to make the mistakes of accepting false demonstrations in order to make others believe that they understand them than they are to make the mistake of rejecting good ones. It is different in philosophy, where it is believed that there is nothing about which is not possible to argue on either side. Thus, few people engage in the search for truth, and many who wish to acquire a reputation as clever thinkers bend all their efforts to arrogant opposition to the most obvious truths. That is why, gentlemen, since my arguments belong to philosophy, however strong they may be, I do not suppose that they will have any great effect unless you take them under your protection. But the esteem which everyone has for your faculty is so great, and the name of the Sorbonne carries such authority that not only is it more deferred to in matter of faith than any other group except the sacred councils, but even in human philosophy, everyone agrees that it is impossible to find anywhere else so much reliability and knowledge, as well as prudence and integrity in the pronouncement of a judgment. Therefore, I do not doubt that if you will deign to give enough attention to this work so as to correct it, for knowing not only my human fallibility, but also my ignorance, I would not dare to affirm that it was free of error, and then to add to it whatever it lacks, to complete whatever is imperfect, and yourselves either to take the trouble to give a more adequate explanation of those points that need it, or at least to advise me of them so that I may work on them. And finally, after the reasons by which I prove that there is a God and that the human soul differs from the body, have been brought to such a degree of clarity and obviousness, which I am sure is possible, that they should be considered very exact demonstrations, if you then will deign to give them the authority of your approbation and publicly testify to their truth and certitude. I do not doubt, I say, that when this has been done, all the errors and false opinions which have ever been entertained on these two questions will soon be effaced from the minds of men, for the expression of the truth will cause all learned and wise men to subscribe to your judgment. And your authority will cause the atheists, who are ordinarily more arrogant than learned and judicious, to set aside their spirit of contradiction, or perhaps themselves defend the arguments which they see being accepted as demonstration by all intelligent people, for fear of appearing not to understand them. And finally, everyone else will easily accept the testimony of so many witnesses and there will no longer be anyone who dares to doubt the existence of God and the real and true distinction between the human soul and body. It is for you who now see the disorders which doubt of these things produces, in your great wisdom, to judge the fruit which would grow out of such belief once it were well established. But it would not be fitting for me further to commend the cause of God and religion to those who have always been the firmest supporters of them and of the Catholic Church. Preface. I have already touched upon these two questions of God and of the human soul in the discourse on the method of rightly conducting the reason and seeking truth in the sciences, which I published in French in the year of 1637. Then I was not concerned to give a complete discussion of the subjects, but only to treat of them in passing, in order to learn from the judgments of the readers in what way I should treat them afterward. For those questions have always seemed to me so important that I judged it appropriate to deal with them more than once. And the road I take to explain them is so little traveled and so far from the ordinary route that I did not think it would be useful to explain it in French in a discourse that might be read by anyone, for fear that those of feeble intellect would think it permissible for them to make the same attempt. In the discourse on method, I requested everyone who found in my writings something worthy of criticism to do me a favor of informing me thereof. There was no noteworthy objections concerning these subjects except two, to which I shall here make a short reply before undertaking a more detailed presentation of them later. The first objection is that it does not follow from the fact that the human mind, reflecting upon its own nature, notes itself solely as a thinking being, that its nature or essence is only to think. The trouble is that this word only excludes all those other qualities that might perhaps also pertain to the nature of the mind. To this objection, I reply that it was not my intention at this point to exclude those qualities from the realm of objective reality with which I was not then concerned, but only from the realm of my thought. My intention was to say that I knew nothing to pertain to my essence except that I was a being which thinks. That is, a being having in itself the faculty of thinking. Nevertheless, I shall show further on how it follows from the fact that I know nothing else which belongs to my essence, that nothing else really does belong to it. The second objection is that it does not follow from the fact that I have in my mind the idea of a thing more perfect than I am, that this idea is more perfect than myself, much less that what is represented by this idea exists. But I reply that in this word idea, there is here an equivocation, for it can be taken materially as an operation of my intellect, and in this sense, it cannot be said to be more perfect than myself. Or it can be taken objectively for the body which is represented by this operation, which even though it is not supposed to exist outside of my understanding, can nevertheless be more perfect than myself in respect to its essence. In the rest of this treatise, I shall show more fully how it follows from the mere fact that I have in my mind an idea of something more perfect than myself, that this thing really exists. In addition, I have seen 2 other rather long works on this subject, which did not so much oppose my reasons as conclusions, and this by arguments drawn from the commonplaces of the atheist. But since arguments of this type cannot make any impression in the minds of those who fully understand my reasoning, and since the judgment of many persons is so weak and irrational that they much more often let themselves be convinced by the first opinions they hear on a subject, however false and unreasonable they may be, than by a refutation of their opinions, which is valid and true, but which is heard later, I do not wish to reply to the arguments here for fear of being obliqued first to report them. I shall only say, in general, that the arguments which atheists use to combat the existence of God always depend either upon the assumption that God has human characteristics, or else upon the assumption that our own minds have so much ability and wisdom that we presume to delimit and comprehend what God can and should do. Thus, all that atheists allege will give us no difficulty if we remind ourselves that we should consider our minds to be finite and limited, and God to be an infinite and incomprehensible being. Now, having paid sufficient attention to the opinions of men, I undertake directly to treat of God and of the human mind, and at the same time to lay the foundation of first philosophy. I do this without expecting any praise for it from the vulgar, and without hoping that my book will be read by many. On the contrary, I would not recommend it to any except to those who want to meditate seriously along with me, and who are capable of freeing the mind from attachment to the senses and clearing it entirely of all sorts of prejudices. And I know only too well that there are very few people of this sort. But as for those who do not care much about the order and connection of my arguments, and who amuse themselves by making clever remarks on the several parts, as some will do, those persons, I say, will not profit much from reading this work. And although they may find opportunities for cavilling in many places, they will hardly be able to make any objections which are important or which are worthy of reply. And since I do not promise others to satisfy them wholly at the first attempt, and since I do not so far presume as to believe that I can foresee all that many entail difficulties for some people, I shall first present in these meditations the same thoughts by which I think I have reached a certain and evident knowledge of the truth, in order to see whether I will be able to persuade others by means of the same reasons that have persuaded me. After that, I shall reply to the objections which have been offered to me by people of insight and learning, to whom I sent my meditations to be examined before committing them to the press. These have been so numerous and so varied that I feel secure in believing that it would be difficult for anyone else to find an objection of consequence that has not already been treated. That is why I beg my readers to suspend their judgment upon the meditations until they have taken the trouble of reading all these objections and the replies that I have made to them. Synopsis of the 6 following meditations. In the first meditation, I offer the reasons why we can doubt all things in general, and particularly material objects, at least as long as we do not have other foundations for the sciences than those we have hitherto possessed. And although it is not immediately apparent that so general a doubt can be useful, it is in fact very much so, since it delivers us from all sorts of prejudices and makes available to us an easy method of accounting our minds to become independent of the senses. Finally, it is useful in making it subsequently impossible to doubt those things which we discover to be true after we have taken doubt into consideration. In the second, the mind, which in its intrinsic freedom supposes that everything which is open to the least doubt is non-existent, recognizes that it is nevertheless absolutely impossible that it does not itself exist. This is also of the highest utility, since by this means the mind can easily distinguish between those qualities which belong to it, that is to say, its intellectual nature, and those things which belong to the body. But because it might happen that some persons will expect me to offer at this point reasons to prove the immortality of the soul, I think it my duty to warn them now that since I have tried to write nothing in this treatise for which I did not have very exact demonstrations, I have found myself obliged to follow an order similar to that used by the geometricians, which is to present first all those things on which the proposition one is seeking to prove depends, before reaching any conclusions about the proposition itself. But the first and principal thing required in order to recognize the immortality of the soul is to form the clearest possible conception of it, and one which is entirely distinct from all the conceptions one can have of the body, which has been done in the second meditation. It is necessary, in addition, to know that all things which we conceive clearly and distinctively are true in the manner in which we conceive them, and this cannot be proved before the fourth meditation. Furthermore, we must have a distinct conception of corporeal nature, which we acquire partly in the second and partly in the fifth and sixth meditations. And finally, we must conclude from all this that things which we clearly and distinctly perceive to be diverse substances, as we conceive the mind and the body, are in fact substances which are really distinct from each other, which is what we conclude in the sixth meditation. This is confirmed again in the same meditation by the fact that we cannot conceive any body except as divisible, while the mind or soul of man can only be conceived as indivisible. For in reality, we cannot conceive of half of any soul as we can of the smallest possible body, so that we recognize that their natures are not only different, but even in some sense contrary. I have not treated this subject further in this treatise, partly because we have already discovered enough to show with sufficient clarity that the corruption of the body does not entail the death of the soul, and so to give men the hope of a second life after death, and partly because the premises from which the immortality of the soul may be concluded depend upon the explanation of the whole of physics. First, we must know that all substances in general, that is to say, all those which cannot exist without being created by God, are by nature incorruptible and can never cease to be, unless God himself, by denying them his usual support, reduces them to nothingness. And secondly, we must notice that body, taken in general, is a substance, and that it therefore will never perish. But the human body, however much it may differ from other bodies, is only a composite produced by certain configuration of members and by other similar accidents, whereas the human soul is not thus dependent upon any accidents, but is a pure substance. For even if all its accidents change, as for example, if it conceives of certain things, wills others, and receives sense impressions of still others, nevertheless it still remains the same soul, but the human body becomes a different entity from the mere fact that the shape of some of its parts has been changed. From this, it follows that the human body may very easily perish, but that the mind or soul of man, between which I find no distinction, is immortal by its very nature. In the third meditation, I have explained at sufficient length, it seems to me, the principal argument I used to prove the existence of God. Nevertheless, I did not want to use at any point any comparisons drawn from physical things in order that the minds of the readers should be as far as possible withdrawn from the use of and commerce with the senses. There may, therefore, be many obscurities remaining, which I hope will be completely elucidated in my replies to the objections which have since been made to me. One of these obscurities is this: how can the idea of a supremely perfect being, which we find in ourselves, contain so much objective reality? That is to say, how can it participate by representation in so many degrees of being and of perfection that it might have come from a supremely perfect cause? This I have explained in these replies by means of a comparison with a very ingenious and artificial machine, the idea of which occurs in the mind of some worker. For as the real cleverness of this idea must have some cause, I conclude it to be either the knowledge of this worker or that some other from whom he has received this idea. In the same way, it is impossible that the idea of God, which is in us, does not have God himself as its cause. In the fourth, it is proved that all things which we conceive or perceive very clearly and very distinctly are wholly true. At the same time, I explain the nature of error or falsity, which nature we ought to discover as much to confirm the preceding truths as to understand better those that follow. Nevertheless, it should be noticed that I do not in any way treat here of sin, that is, of error committed in the pursuit of good and evil, but only of that which occurs in the judgment and discernment of the true and the false. And that I do not intend to speak on beliefs which belong to faith or to the conduct of life, but only of those which pertain to speculative truth and which can be known by the aid of the light of the nature alone. In the fifth meditation, besides the explanation of corporeal nature in general, the existence of God is again demonstrated by a new argument. There may also be some difficulties in this argument, but the solution will be found in the replies to the objections which have been made to me. In addition, I show how it is true that even the certainty of geometrical demonstrations themselves depends on the knowledge of God. Finally, in the sixth, I distinguish the action of the understanding from that of the imagination. And the marks of this distinction are described. Here I show that the mind or the soul of a man is really distinct from the body, and that nevertheless it is so tightly bound and united with it that it forms with it what almost is a single entity. All the errors which arise from the senses are here exposed, together with the methods of avoiding them. And finally, I here bring out all the arguments from which we may conclude the existence of material things, not because I judge them very useful in that they prove what they do prove, namely that there is a world that men have bodies and other similar things which have never been doubted by any man of good sense. But because in considering these arguments more closely, we come to recognize that they are not as firm and as evident as those which lead us to the knowledge of God and of our soul, so that the latter are the most certain and the most evident truths which can become known to the human mind. That is all that I had planned to prove in these meditations, which leads me to omit here many other questions with which I have dealt incidentally in this treatise. The first meditation concerning things that can be doubted. There's no novelty to me in the reflection that from my earliest years, I have accepted many false opinions as true, and that what I have concluded from such badly assured premises could not but be highly doubtful and uncertain. From the time that I first recognized this fact, I have realized that if I wish to have any firm and constant knowledge in the sciences, I would have to undertake once and for all to set aside all the opinions which I had previously accepted among my beliefs and start again from the very beginning. But this enterprise appeared to me to be of very great magnitude, and so I waited until I had attained an age so mature that I could not hope for a later time when I would be more fitted to execute the project. Now, however, I have delayed so long that henceforward I should be afraid that I was committing a fault if, in continuing to deliberate, I expended time which should be devoted to action. The present is opportune for my design. I have freed my mind of all kinds of cares. I feel myself fortunately disturbed by no passions, and I have found a serene retreat in peaceful solitude. I will therefore make a serious and unimpeded effort to destroy generally all my former opinions. In order to do this, however, it will not be necessary to show that they are all false, a task which I might never be able to complete, because since reason already convinces me that I should abstain from the belief in things which are not entirely certain and indubitable no less carefully than from the belief in those which appear to me to be manifestly false, it will be enough to make me reject them all if I can find in each some ground for doubt. And for that, it will not be necessary for me to examine each one in particular, which would be an infinite labor. But since the destruction of the foundation necessarily involves the collapse of all the rest of the edifice, I shall first attack the principles upon which all my former opinions were founded. Everything which I have thus far accepted as entirely true and assured has been acquired from the senses or by means of the senses, but I have learned by experience that these senses sometimes misled me, and it is prudent never to trust wholly those things which have once deceived us. But it is possible that even though the senses occasionally deceive us about things which are barely perceptible and very far away, there are many other things which we cannot reasonably doubt, even though we know them through the senses. As, for example, that I am here, seated by the fire, wearing a winter dressing gown, holding this paper in my hands, and other things of this nature. And how could I deny that these hands and this body are mine unless I am to compare myself with other lunatics whose brain is so troubled and befogged by the black vapors of the bile that they continually affirm that they are kings while they are paupers, that they are clothed in gold and purple while they are naked, or imagine that their head is made of clay, or that they are gourds, or that their body is glass. But this is ridiculous. Such men are fools, and I would be no less insane than they if I followed their example. Nevertheless, I must remember that I am a man, and that consequently I am accustomed to sleep and in my dreams to imagine the same things that lunatics imagine when awake, or sometimes things which are even less plausible. How many times has it occurred that the quiet of the night made me dream of my usual habits, that I was here clothed in a dressing gown, sitting by the fire, although I was in fact laying undressed in bed. It seems apparent to me now that I am not looking at this paper with my eyes closed, that this head that I shake is not drugged with sleep, that it is with design and deliberate intent that I stretch out my hand and perceive it. What happens in sleep seems not at all as clear and as distinct as all this, but I'm speaking as though I never recall having been misled while asleep by similar illusions. When I consider these matters carefully, I realize so clearly that there are no conclusive indications by which waking life can be distinguished from sleep, that I am quite astonished, and my bewilderment is such that it is almost able to convince me that I am sleeping. So let us suppose now that we are asleep and that all these details, such as opening the eyes, shaking the head, extending the hands, and similar things are merely illusions. And let us think that perhaps our hands and our whole body are not such as we see them. Nevertheless, we must at least admit that these things which appear to us in sleep are like painted scenes and portraits which can only be formed in imitation of something real and true. And so, at the very least, these types of things, namely eyes, head, hands, and the whole body are not imaginary entities, but real and existent. For in truth, painters, even when they use the greatest ingenuity in attempting to portray sirens and satyrs in bizarre and extraordinary ways, nevertheless cannot give them wholly new shapes and natures, but only invent some particular mixture composed of parts of various animals, or even if perhaps their imagination is sufficiently extravagant that they invent something so new that nothing like it has ever been seen, until their work represents something purely imaginary and absolutely false. Certainly, at the very least, the colors of which they are composed must be real. And for the same reason, even if these types of things, namely a body, eyes, head, hands, and other similar things, could be imaginary, nevertheless, we are bound to confess that there are some other still more simple and universal concepts which are true and existent, from the mixture of which neither more nor less than in the case of the mixture of real colors, all these images of things are formed in our minds, whether they are true and real or imaginary and fantastic. Of this class of entities is corporeal nature in general and its extension, including the shape of extended things, their quantity or size and number, and also the place where they are, the time that measures their duration, and so forth. That is why we will perhaps not be reasoning badly if we conclude that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all the other sciences which follow from the consideration of composite entities are very dubious and uncertain, whereas arithmetic, geometry, and the other sciences of this nature, which treat only of very simple and general things without concerning themselves as to whether they occur in nature or not, contain some element of certainty and sureness. For whether I am awake or whether I'm asleep, 2 and 3 together will always make the number 5, and the square will never have more than 4 sides. And it does not seem possible that truths so clear and so apparent can ever be suspected of any falsity or uncertainty. Nevertheless, I have long held the belief that there is a God who can do anything, by whom I have been created and made what I am. But how can I be sure but that he has brought it to pass that there is no earth, no sky, no extended bodies, no shape, no size, no place, and that nevertheless I have the impression of all these things and cannot imagine that things might be other than as I now see them. And furthermore, just as I sometimes judge that others are mistaken about those things which they think they know best, how can I be sure but that God has brought it about that I am always mistaken when I add 2 or 3 or count the sides of a square, or when I judge of something else even easier, if I can imagine anything easier than that? But perhaps God did not wish me to be deceived in that fashion, since he is said to be supremely good. But if it was repugnant to his goodness to have made me so that I was always mistaken, it would seem also to be inconsistent for him to permit me to sometimes be mistaken, and nevertheless, I cannot doubt that he does permit it. At this point, there will perhaps be some persons who would prefer to deny the existence of so powerful a God rather than to believe that everything else is uncertain. Let us not oppose them for the moment, and let us concede according to their point of view that everything which I have stated here about God is fictitious. Then, in whatever way they suppose that I have reached the state of being that I now have, whether they attribute it to some destiny or fate, or refer to it as chance, or whether they wish to explain it as a result of the continual interplay of events, or in any other manner, nevertheless, since to err and be mistaken is a kind of imperfection, to whatever degree less powerful they consider the author to whom they can attribute my origin, in that degree it will be more probable that I am so imperfect that I am always mistaken. To this reasoning, certainly I have nothing to reply, and I am at last constrained to admit that there is nothing in what I formerly believed to be true which I cannot somehow doubt. And this is not for lack of thought and attention, but for weighty and well-considered reasons. Thus, I find that in the future I should withhold and suspend my judgment about these matters, and guard myself no less carefully from believing them than I should be from believing what is manifestly false.